Nice going, Theresa May. Nice going. Good job. Well done. Way to go. You just pulled off what may be perhaps the biggest blunder in British political history, at least, let's say, within the past generation or two. Wow. Look, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on British politics or political history here, but I do know a thing or two about it, and it seems to me this might have been the most colossal blunder in British politics since Margaret Thatcher's poll tax. I could be wrong. This has got to be one for the books at the very least. Theresa May, who already only came to power because her predecessor, David Cameron, also held a vote that was not absolutely necessary, gambling that he could win it, and ended up losing and resigned as a result. And then she follows him. She tries to fill his shoes. And at first, it seems like she and her party are in a relatively strong position. After all, the opposition is divided. The main opposition party, Labour, is led by this Jeremy Corbyn has a lot of his own issues. For a long time, he seemed like a complete bumbler. And frankly, as a libertarian, a lot of his policy positions are just not my cup of tea. Let's just leave it at that. But somehow, Theresa May has managed to flush all of that down the toilet. All for little or nothing. There are a few things about her decision to call this rash and foolish snap election that I just don't get. That I just can't wrap my mind around for the life of me. For starters, she promised repeatedly that she would not do exactly what she's done, namely call an early election. Time after time, she said she was not going to call an election before 2020. What sense did it make for her to go back on that particular promise? Now, don't get it twisted, okay? I'm no complete neophyte. I'm not naive. I know perfectly well that virtually all politicians lie to one degree or another. However, that does not mean that all broken political promises are the same. They're not all created equal. Some of them are definitely more unwise and foolish than others. This particular promise that Theresa May made was one of those political promises that are actually very easy for lay people to understand, ordinary voters, the kinds of folks who don't necessarily tune into politics regularly, the kinds of folks who are not familiar with the vagaries and intricacies of politics and governance and public policy and statesmanship. Even those folks can understand a promise as simple, direct, and straightforward as, I will not call a snap election. That is exactly the kind of promise that politicians are most unwise to break. And it's such an ostentatious way to break it. And less than a year after Theresa May took office as Prime Minister. What sense did that make? If you're going to break a political promise, you got to break it quietly, subtly, and ideally at least a few years after you initially made the promise, in the hopes that at least most of the voters won't remember it, and hopefully that the few who do remember it won't particularly care. Instead, you break the promise in this ostentatious manner less than a year after you made it, repeatedly. Not good politics, Theresa. Not smart. Here's another reason. She stated that there's too much division in Parliament and it would undermine the government's negotiating position in the upcoming Brexit negotiations. So this election was supposedly supposed to paper over or reconcile some of those divisions. I don't buy it. I don't think that was ever likely to be the case. At the end of the day, you had a majority government in place. As long as you could keep your caucus on side, in your corner, voting the way you want to do, there wasn't any need to call a snap election in order to prevent whatever divisions exist in Parliament from undermining your government's position. As for society at large, the electorate, elections are not unifying exercises, generally speaking. If anything, they usually tend to be divisive exercises. You're throwing the divisions in the society into sharp relief by pitting different parties with opposing viewpoints against each other and forcing them to butt heads. How is that going to be unifying? It's not. It was never going to have a unifying effect. I think I remember Theresa May saying some months ago that a new election would help resolve some of the divisions wrought by the Brexit referendum last year. Yeah, right. From the very beginning, I scoffed and sucked my teeth, Trini style, at that ridiculous proposal. Never made any sense. And now we see the evidence of it. Now, with this hung parliament, this minority government that Theresa May and the Tories have been busted down to, now there's going to be more uncertainty and political instability than ever, even though stability was supposed to be exactly what she would provide. That was supposed to be her forte. So much for that. I just don't understand what the upshot of this gamble was supposed to be. Anytime you take a risk, you want to know that the payoff is going to be worth the risk. You want to know that the payoff is going to outweigh the potential downside if the gamble doesn't go your way. What was really going to be the payoff here? That the Tories would win an even larger majority than they already had? That was never going to make a vast or particularly meaningful or fundamental change to the status quo. They already had a majority. Obviously, a larger majority is more secure than the modest, relatively narrow one that they enjoyed after the 2015 election. But still, it never made sense, especially given the other criteria involved, the potential for exacerbating the divisions in British society, and of course that by calling the election, Theresa May was breaking a major promise that she made. Given all those other factors, it just didn't make sense to say, well, despite all the risk of it backfiring, at least we'll have a stronger majority in power. No. Frankly, from what I remember, a lot of accounts said that the Tories were lucky to win the last election in 2015, or at least lucky to win a majority government. It didn't make sense to risk pissing that away. For what? To improve her negotiating position in Brexit? I don't get it. I don't buy it. Meanwhile, the downside was very substantial. By risking losing power or losing her majority in Parliament, Theresa May risked upsetting the apple cart that's already been upset thanks to last summer's Brexit referendum. And that's the other thing. It doesn't make sense for any politician pretty much anywhere, well, I shouldn't say anywhere, but in a lot of Western countries nowadays, whether it's the US, the UK, France, as we saw recently, it doesn't make sense to go into these elections overconfident, even if the polls have you out ahead. Hillary Clinton learned that lesson the hard way. French politicians, mainstream politicians learned that the hard way when the two runoff candidates ended up being the outsider Emmanuel Macron and, of course, Marine Le Pen. I mean, Lord have mercy, folks. There are some countries in the Western world that still enjoy relative political stability, such as our own country of Canada. But in countries like the UK, what with Brexit last year, it never made sense for Theresa May to go into this election so overconfident. A lot of Western political systems are in flux right now. There's a lot of instability. There are a lot of changes going on. A lot of voters are voting in ways that they may not have voted in the past. Things are changing. The ground is shifting underneath our feet. This was not the right political climate, an opportune moment for Theresa May to use to call an entirely unnecessary snap election. I'm sorry, but Theresa May was just off her rocker calling this election. I don't know what she was thinking. I mean, really thinking. I'm not talking about what she said in public. The stated rationales for her decision to call this election. I mean, what was really going through her head in private, behind closed doors, away from prying eyes and the harsh glare of public scrutiny. What was she really thinking? God alone only knows. But she's lucky to still be leader of the British Conservative Party, and I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't remain leader of the party for very much longer. I doubt the party will overthrow her Margaret Thatcher style with the Brexit negotiations still coming up so soon. But once that's over, and depending on how it goes, I wouldn't be surprised if Theresa May does not survive to see the next election that should have taken place in 2019 or 2020. And of course, minority governments in general don't typically last very long anyway. So, ladies and gentlemen, buckle your seatbelts. We're in for yet another rough ride in yet another Western democracy. Stay tuned.